Hello, everybody. If you're new to our webinar series, welcome and thank you for joining us. Criterion Edge runs multiple informative webinars throughout the year. For today's webinar topic, we'll be discussing scoping your MDR and IVDR writing projects, the forgotten step. We are proud to announce that Criterion Edge has been awarded Company of the Year among top regulatory services companies. If you'd like to speak with us about your upcoming projects or regulatory writing needs, we would be happy to book an appointment with you. You can email us at consult@criterionedge.com. Our presenter today is Principal Medical Writer Dr. Sarah Chavez, Director of IVD and Scientific Writing Services with Criterion Edge. Sarah has a BS in biochemistry and a PhD in molecular and cellular biology with 25 years of laboratory bench experience and has taught at the university level for 20 years. She has extensive scientific writing experience in an academic environment, as well as for several large textbook publishers. Sarah's strong background in basic research and her extensive experience with regulatory writing will allow her to assist companies with IVDR readiness as part of the Criterion Edge team. All right, let's go ahead and get started. Sarah, I will turn it over to you to give an overview of our session today.
Hey, great. Thank you, Olivia, and thank you to everyone who's joining us today. So in most of our webinars, for those of you who've attended in the past, you probably have noticed that we focus a lot on the writing process itself, including detailed discussions of things like systematic literature review and examples of how to organize the important information and data within your CER or your PER. We realized, though, that we have never really discussed what happens before that writing process actually begins. So in today's webinar, we're going to be focusing on the process of scoping a project for either MDR or IVDR. We will walk you through some of the same questions we typically ask our clients when we begin writing a new project. And our goal is to illustrate the importance of this early planning and scoping in identifying the key inputs and potential gaps that are needed to help you really kickstart the project and to keep your team on track during the entire process. So specifically, we will be discussing how to plan a realistic timeline for your project, and we will provide advice for assessing your team's bandwidth. And then we'll also present examples of some of these key documents and inputs that are needed early in the writing process and describe where and how these pieces fit within the CER or PER templates. Now, before we get into specifics, we thought we would share a few thoughts using a fairly familiar example. When we prepare for a new project, we often equate it to a Jenga Tower. These reports are assembled from many individual documents and pieces. So there are a lot of moving parts to pull together. But when properly built, the report must be able to stand on its own. If you simply throw these pieces into a pile without a solid template, that's a very risky strategy. If you do not have a solid template or a plan, and you're simply submitting a series of reports without proper structure and organization, your tower winds up looking very shaky, or in the worst case scenario, it could just be a jumbled pile of blocks. Are all of the pieces there? Probably. But is your notified body excited to dig through that pile looking for all of these pieces while they're attempting to reconstruct your tower for you? Not likely. Now, similarly, much like a Jenga tower, a CER or a PER is only as strong and stable as its weakest part. So even if the client has provided the majority of these pieces, and we are confident that these pieces are well written and perfectly placed within the template, a missing piece will be quite obvious when it is subjected to scrutiny. So the process itself could ultimately fail to effectively demonstrate safety and performance if information is missing or if it's not properly developed or presented. Which brings us to the purpose of today's webinar. How can scoping help you set your team up for success and avoid building reports with these obvious gaps or missing pieces? Now, in most of our previous webinars, we frequently refer to MedDev 2.7-1 Rev 4, and today's webinar is no exception. The purpose of the MedDevs, though, is to promote a common approach to be followed by manufacturers and notified bodies that are involved in the conformity assessment procedures. These guides are drafted by authorities in conjunction with all of the stakeholders, including industry associations, health associations, notified bodies, and European standardization associations. According to MedDev Rev 4, a clinical evaluation is based on a comprehensive analysis of the pre and post-market clinical data relevant to the intended purpose of the device in question, and that will include safety and performance data. Now, this figure here is illustrating the discrete stages in performing a clinical evaluation according to MedDev. And these same steps apply to the performance evaluation if you are one of our IVDR colleagues. Stage 1 defines the scope and the plan for the clinical evaluation. So that's what we're going to be focusing on today. Stages 1 and 2 involve identifying pertinent data and appraising each individual data set in terms of scientific validity, relevance, and weighting. For these topics, I would refer you to some of our previous webinars, including our IVD deep dive series, where we discussed leveraging clinical data in the CPR, and last month's webinar, where we discussed how to establish the competitive landscape within the SVR. Now in stage 3, this is where you will be analyzing the data and making conclusions regarding compliance with essential requirements. The contents of the informational materials, such as the label and the IFU, and a discussion of residual risk and uncertainties or unanswered questions. This is where you will have an assessment of whether these are acceptable risks for CE marking, and you may also describe how this risk will be addressed during post-market surveillance activities. Only after all of these stages can the report be finalized. So remember, this report is an assessment of all relevant data, and it must ensure that all relevant technical documentation is organized, summarized, and referenced. If we again consider our Jenga example, the report represents the well-organized and perfectly stacked tower, but it relies on the strength of and integrity of these individual tech docs to achieve that balance. As MedDev Rev 4 notes, each of those stages may be iterative. So new information can and often is uncovered, and that may require changes to expand the scope of the evaluation, or changes to the clinical evaluation plan, or it may even necessitate collection and analysis of additional data and appraisals. You may have thought that your tower was fully assembled, but what happens if you uncover a piece that needs to be added or removed at the very end? Clearly, it would be preferable to have a solid sense of how many pieces you're working with before you start building your tower. So really, that's where scoping comes in. This table was adapted from MedDev Rev 4 just to provide a visual descriptor of some of the key aspects to consider during scoping. Before a clinical evaluation is even began, a manufacturer should define its scope based on the essential requirements that need to be addressed from a clinical perspective and the nature and the history of the device. So that's how MedDev defines this scoping step. The scope will ultimately serve as a basis for each of the next steps in the writing process, including the identification of pertinent data. You're expected to provide a description of the device under evaluation and an evaluation plan. But this evaluation must be critical. So it must be able to identify, appraise, and analyze favorable and unfavorable data in an objective, well-described, unbiased process. Depending on the stage of the life cycle of your product, considerations for setting up a clinical evaluation plan should include some of these different aspects noted here. So in this slide, I'm breaking down the table that you've just seen into 3 main chunks based on sort of the overall scope and the overall the way that these pieces fit together in your final product. So we're going to start with an assessment of the device itself. According to MedDev Rev 4, if you look in Appendix 3, the description must be detailed enough to allow for a valid evaluation of the state of compliance with essential requirements. and the retrieval of meaningful literature data, and if applicable, the assessment of equivalence to other devices described in the scientific literature. So if we break that down into the simplest terms, that will include things like the names, the models, different components, etc. But it should also include information regarding the current status for CE marking for this device. You should be prepared to make note of any physical or chemical descriptions, the technical specifications, and other aspects or design features. So suppose you've begun writing your CER for a device, but at the last minute, your R&D team tells you that changes are being made to your device design. If your device is something like a guide wire, maybe you've added a new length or a diameter or a tip shape. Maybe you've changed the composition of the materials. Each of those changes will directly impact your clinical data, and that will require a reassessment of your indications and your patient populations potentially. It could also directly impact your choice of competitors, so that's something to keep in mind. This could include a need to expand your indications, and it could affect your performance objectives, because maybe this new design change makes it easier for you to use in a new procedure, and you start to observe a significant number of studies that are reporting off-label use of your device. So all of these types of design changes can have substantial impacts on not only the CER, but also your PMS and your risk management documents. For our IVDR teams on the call today, suppose you have a PCR test and your research and development team has recently updated this assay to include additional primer sets or gene targets in an attempt to improve accuracy. For instance, we've seen some IVDs that you start by using one set of primer designs in the original version of the product, but later assays having added or tweaked those primer sets because studies that have been identified had noted certain limitations in real-world clinical scenarios. Maybe certain primer sets are known to not work in a particular patient population quite as well. Or perhaps you have several singleplex assays that are now being combined into a single multiplex assay. All of those changes can directly impact the scientific validity of the assay, the analytes that you will be describing, the intended purpose, as well as hazards and risks. But much like the MDR guidewire example, this design change could also impact your choice of competitors. Do you want to screen and extract the data for both the newer and the older versions of your test when you're determining the competitive landscape? All of these decisions are critical, and they may directly impact not only your SOA section, but also the background information presented in the narrative, and ultimately your acceptance criteria. So this is a good time to introduce, in very simple terms, the concept of equivalence in this discussion. In order to demonstrate equivalence, clinical, technical, and biological characteristics must be assessed. Some changes may have no impact on the intended purpose or the technical specifications, while other changes may result in significant changes, meaning you cannot claim equivalence. So we recommend that during scoping, go ahead and start by identifying all relevant clinical documentations, including but not limited to your IFU, labels, and the detailed technical and analytical performance test results. It may not seem like something your writer would need, but it actually helps quite a bit as we're planning these projects. These directly impact not only the state-of-the-art section, but also your risk assessment and other key components of these reports. So as you're assembling these documents and developing a strategy, some critical early questions include, are the IFUs finalized? And is the intended purpose well defined? What are the intended performance objectives that you want to assess? Are there clinical benefits that you've identified? And can they be supported by the literature that you are assessing? This can often be the point during the writing process where you can distinguish between a marketing claim and a benefit. The marketing literature may include certain claims for performance, but can that claim be supported by actual real-world data in order to be included as a supported clinical benefit? Your device may have the benefit of being usable in smaller anatomies, such as a pediatric population, but if you don't have any data to support that claim, It's just that, it's a claim. It's not an actual benefit yet. Now, some other questions to ask are there previous versions of this device that will also be identified? And do you want to include them in your assessment? And that brings us to the final question. If so, can equivalence be demonstrated? So we just mentioned a few scenarios such as expanded or off-label uses, or having a claim that's not well supported by existing data. Each of these issues can also be related to these next three aspects of scoping: the risk, the SOA, and your data sources. During your assessment, you may find that issues are raised when medical alternatives with lower risks or more benefits to patients are available or have become newly available. You may also note that issues could arise if new risks are recognized, including risks due to progress in medicine, science, and technology, not even through the fault of your device itself. This often leads our clients to ask the critical question: when should additional clinical investigations be carried out? Or more commonly, what do I need to do to avoid having to initiate a new planned clinical investigation for my device? We address this common concern of data sufficiency quite a bit, including in some of our previous Ask the Experts webinars. But rest assured that you are not alone in having this fear. This also illustrates, though, the importance of the 2 points that are shown here in this table, the SOA and the data sources. If you refer to MedDev Rev 4 Appendix 2, when clinical data is required to draw conclusions as to the conformity of the device, the data must be in line with current knowledge and state of the art to be scientifically sound, to cover all aspects of the intended purpose and all products, models, sizes, and settings foreseen by you, the manufacturer. So your SOA should therefore be designed in such a way to ensure that you've covered all aspects. If the intended purpose has changed late in the course of a project, that could require repeating searches relevant to this state-of-the-art section. And conversely, if the state-of-the-art search does not identify any relevant data for a specific population or one of your claimed intended purposes, it may be necessary to look for any and all sources of data to support those statements. So this is part of the scoping process. There are different sources of clinical data that can be searched for clinical evaluation. A comprehensive search strategy is required, and that typically involves multiple databases. It's not just a PubMed search or a simple Google search. A search strategy should be documented and justified, and important sources include scientific literature databases such as Medline. You can include PubMed for sure, and Embase, but you can also rely on certain targeted internet searches to identify harmonized standards, clinical registry reports, expert documents and opinions, and field safety corrective actions. Non-published data, which we refer to as the manufacturer-held data, can also be referenced, as well as citations that have been referenced in the articles that you've identified, which we call citation mining. Now, let's suppose that after looking through all of these available data sets, you still have gaps. In that case, clinical investigations may be needed, and your plan will include a discussion of how these investigations will be planned and carried out. So these study plans in your CEP or PEP are directly informed and supported by the information that you've identified during the writing of your SOA. The writing of the SOA directly informs multiple aspects of these evaluation plans, as well as the actual report itself. The need for clinical investigations depends on the ability of the existing data to adequately address the benefit risk profile, the claims, and the side effects in order to comply with the applicable essential requirements. So if you're trying to decide if additional clinical investigations need to be carried out, you should perform a detailed gap analysis, and that overlaps quite well with your SOA section. The gap analysis should determine whether the existing data are sufficient to verify that your device is in conformity with the essential requirements pertaining to clinical performance and clinical safety. So if we bring this back to scoping, the SOA section can provide those critical insights into multiple technical documents, because this search is giving you a lay of the land. It's giving you a sense of what's currently happening in the medical field as a whole. It includes a summary of the guidelines, the condition, and alternatives. So during the scoping process for writing the SOA section, ask yourself, are risks well established, or have I identified any new risks associated with this particular device or IVD in my current search? Are these risks justified, and are they supported by the clinical benefits that we're claiming? In clinical real-world data situations, is it available for your device and your competitors? What are your PICO terms? These will be used to outline and support the SOA analysis, and these terms are critical for crafting well-designed systematic literature review strategies. They will include the population or the patients, the types of interventions and indications, the controls or comparators or alternatives, as well as the outcomes. If you forget to include a relevant term here, you may not capture important data in your review, and that can result in substantial gaps in your final report. And if you're not sure about what to include in your PICO terms, this is where having an experienced reference librarian is extremely helpful. And finally, we have the scoping should take into account what you have learned during the preparation of your previous reports. So these are the aspects of scoping that are related to a currently CE marked device. The report is a document, but it's ultimately reporting on a process. During the lifetime of a device, changes will occur. New information will be reported in the literature, and new options and alternatives may become available. Our knowledge of the disease may itself also change and evolve. The searches and the data that are presented in the report can and should inform future data collection and post-market surveillance planning activities. So some final questions to ask yourself are, have changes been made to the device since the last time I wrote an update? Has the plan identified any new concerns? And is my current PMS plan sufficient? Okay, so here at Criterion Edge, we spend a lot of time discussing the importance of the SOA section, and for good reason. The SOA assessment is critical to establishing what is currently and generally considered the standard of care or best practice for the medical condition or the treatment for which a device is used. Or in the case of an IVD, the diagnosis that the IVD is facilitating. But the information contained within the SOA is also critical to scoping the entire CER or PER process, because this section will serve to connect each of these reports together to tell the full story and provide the context for your device. So back to our Jenga example, you can think of the process of planning and scoping your SOA section as if this is your chance to check all of your pieces before you begin to build the tower. Do you have all of these pieces? Are they balanced? Are some of the sections, as you begin to assemble it, shakier than others? Maybe your tower is solid for one indication, but you're missing pieces of data to support another indication. Are all of the pieces individually balanced and well supported? Does the information build on itself in a clear and a logical format? Trying to build a tower on a narrow base is clearly not a great strategy for building a strong tower. So as such, we need to know the intended purpose, and we need to carefully review the IFU to help us plan the outline for the SOA section. We must design searches to capture information relevant to the PICO terms as part of the SOA search. We must identify relevant safety and performance objectives to identify data for our competitor search. And then we must also identify safety and performance data that's been published relative to our subject device. In order to screen, select, extract, and appraise these data, early decisions need to be made with regards to the safety and performance measures you're capturing, any potential reasons for excluding an article, the way that you're going to present this data, whether you're using a tabular or a narrative format, and then finally, how are your acceptance criteria going to be established? Changes to any of these decisions can and will affect your overall timelines for the writing process. So getting everyone on the same page early in the process is critical to project management. So to summarize, when you're conducting a gap assessment, this is a critical step for the success of your MDR or IVDR process. Ask yourself, what inputs do I need to write this report? When are they needed by? And finally, will they be ready when I need them? Approaching these scoping questions as a gap analysis exercise, you can begin by identifying and assessing the critical elements needed to support the evaluation process. For example, your regulatory strategy. Are you confident that it's finalized? Have decisions been made with respect to device groupings or device families within a single CER or PER? This is a pivotal decision that must be finalized early, certainly before you begin writing. Next, what is the status of all necessary input to the CER or PER? Where is the data? This includes all clinical data sources, including your performance analysis data, data derived from your PMS activities, and if available, the systematic literature reviews of clinical and analytical data. Are these critical documents such as the IFU finalized, or are they still being revised? In our experience, this is a source of critical timeline issues for many of our clients downstream. And then finally, resourcing and timelines. That is sort of the last step of scoping. Regarding timelines, are they firmly established? And have you allowed yourself enough time to finish the CER or PER and built in time to manage some of these roadblocks or potential changes? Have you fully assessed available resources within your organization? Do you have solid and reliable templates for documents like the CER and PER, but also the supporting technical documents like SVRs, APRs, your PMS and your PMPF plans? If you have these templates, how confident are you in these templates that they're actually MDR or IVDR compliant? Will they pass the test if they're subject to a notified body review? Do you have access to expertise within your organization? With regard to CER writing, I can tell you from experience that our team is often brought into projects very late in the game and asked to help fix a poorly written CER that did not pass initial notified body scrutiny when it was attempted in-house. The answers to many of the scoping questions that we've discussed today are often not clear, even after this draft is provided to us. And that really helps to explain a lot of the challenges that those projects had from the get-go. Organization and strategy is crucial. So writing an MDR or an IVDR compliant report is certainly not a job that you want to leave to someone who's inexperienced with the overall process and all of the moving pieces. And that brings us to the final part of the gap assessment, bandwidth. I have no doubt that many of our clients have staff who could absolutely complete these projects if time and money was of no concern, and this report was literally all they had to do. But ask yourself, do you have access to enough human power within the available time frame to do the job of compiling these documents, performing all of these searches, screening and selecting literature, not to mention actually extracting, writing, reviewing, and QCing these reports, which are often 200 to 300 pages. So I hope in today's webinar that we've been helpful in providing relevant advice and insights as to why scoping is so critical for the ultimate success of your PER and CER writing. What information should be established early in that writing process, and how indecision or incomplete supporting documents can negatively impact the CER and PER quality and timelines. We hope that we've shown how a gap assessment can help you prevent some of these unanticipated roadblocks or delays, and the importance of planning very realistic timelines and assessing your team's bandwidth for completing these projects. So now I'd like to turn it over to Olivia, and we will hopefully be able to answer a bunch of the questions that we got after today's webinar during the registration.
Great, thanks, Sarah. That was an excellent walkthrough of the scoping process. We have received many questions ahead of this webinar and selected some to answer. If you haven't sent us in your question yet, you can do so now using the Q&A button on your Zoom menu bar, and we will answer them in the order that we receive them. So now let's get started with our first question. Okay, so this attendee is asking, what are the key mistakes people make when scoping?
I think ultimately the first mistake is not having a well thought out checklist to follow. Sometimes you don't know to ask a question. You can't answer a question if you didn't ask it. So in many cases, some of the questions that we as the outside sort of objective writer are things that you probably know the answer to, but you haven't really thought about. And that can really affect your timelines if you forget to add something. Like, for instance, if you have a particular indication that your device is used for commonly, and it's actually like it's an intended purpose, if you forget to include some of those keywords in your searches, you may forget to include that altogether in your state of the art section. Or maybe there were changes that occurred after the fact that removed a particular indication for your device. So ultimately, I think it comes down to knowing who to ask these questions to within your organization, who would have that information and the level of detail needed, but also knowing what questions to ask and having sort of a process for really putting the time in during this planning stage.
All right, thanks, Sarah. Here's our next question. This person is asking, are there any insights regarding the level of clinical evidence required to mitigate the need to perform a new study?
Yes, I think especially from IVDR clients, this is an area of a lot of concern for many of them. Everyone's trying to avoid having to initiate a brand new study. So I'm hoping in the presentation I was able to allude to some of these strategies, but I think the main one that I would point out is knowing your sources of data and designing a very well-crafted search, getting beyond just PubMed. You can find a significant amount of data published if you expand your searches to include multiple databases and platforms. And also if you start relying on some of that, the registry data and some of the other alternative sources of data. Ultimately, though, you are putting your faith in someone else publishing data regarding your device. So it is a little bit scary in that you don't have control over your own destiny. If the information is not published out there, you may need to conduct a new study. But the state-of-the-art searches and the competitor searches and even the subject device search will really give you a better sense of how to design that study to be efficient and to be comparable to the existing studies so that you are using the same performance objectives and safety objectives. We've seen this quite a bit where one device may use a certain set of performance objectives, but literally all of the competitor data that we're finding uses a different metric for measuring success, or they use a different scale for recording certain safety outcomes. So those are important pieces to know before you begin to plan a study in the event that you do need a study. So really starting with those well-crafted searches will tell you if you've literally searched everything that you can find to find the data that's out there. And then once you have done that, you'll know basically what's the best practice. How are other people conducting similar studies?
All right. Sarah, do you have any tips for gap analysis between MDR and MDD?
Honestly, the biggest thing that I've seen in our clients where they will bring us a CER that's MDD compliant, and we are trying to make sure it's MDR compliant. That state-of-the-art section is often woefully underwritten. And that's usually one of the major gaps. So going back in and having this scoping conversation after you already have an existing MDD document is actually quite helpful, because you'll start to notice that some of the data that you're collecting and reporting in the MDD reports are not aligned with what is actually expected and required for MDR. You want to be very purposeful in how you're presenting the search strategies and the systematic literature review process itself too. So that's another very common gap that we've found, is that often the review and the collection of data is not as systematic as it should be. and the process has not been well documented. Sometimes these MDD documents that we receive are quite old, and trying to reference material as being state of the art when it was a study that was published 10, 20 years ago is not sort of the level of rigor that they're expecting. You can certainly refer to older studies, but it's expected that in your competitive landscape, you're presenting the most current data that exists for your particular device.
Okay, here's our next question. This one is an interesting one. How much knowledge should the writer have on a specific disease area, and how much information should be provided by the client?
I think, as any good writer can tell you, we can usually pick up the specific information on the disease area pretty quickly. So in my experience, it's more important to get someone who is a good writer than someone who's necessarily an expert in the field, because each of these reports will undergo cross-functional review. You're going to send it to the experts within your own company to review and note any sort of issues with the way the data is presented or any potential gaps. So the key part of it, though, is to really have a writer who can get all of this information down on paper to where it can then be presented and have a logical flow to it. So when we are approaching the client, we often ask for a lot of the technical documents and basically any sort of older drafts, any sort of information that they can provide regarding their device. You will always be the expert on your device compared to the writer, but the writer can help you have an objective view of your device and where it sits in the overall landscape. And it actually helps quite a bit to come in with that bit of objectivity, because you are actively looking for alternatives. You're not sort of pre-assuming which alternatives you're going to include in your discussions. So really, I think finding someone who is comfortable and confident with writing and able to present this data in a clear and concise way is more critical than having someone who's an expert in the field who you're trying to shoehorn into the role of the writer.
Great answer. All right, let's get to our next question. What if the IVDR is novel and there are no equivalent IVDs for comparison? What would you do in this situation, Sarah?
We have come across that in several instances, especially when you've got sort of a new technology, or if your particular device is serving sort of a niche for a particular type of testing. In that instance, I would ask yourself, what alternatives exist if before your test was here, or if someone cannot order your test, what would they do to make that diagnosis? So for instance, with something like a COVID test, before testing was readily available, how were people making a diagnosis of COVID infection? Well, they could use a chest CT. Is that exactly analogous to your PCR test? Absolutely not. They're apples and oranges. A chest CT can make a diagnosis, but it's not very specific. Whereas a PCR test is highly specific. But if you happen to be the first and the only PCR test for this particular novel pathogen on the market, you have to look to some of these alternatives and then provide a detailed explanation of the benefits provided and the risks associated with your particular test compared to some of these alternatives.
Okay, this next question is a good one. This attendee is asking how to best handle timelines and delays for the last documents of the process.
We got so many questions about timelines. I think that's definitely something that's in all of our minds. I would say that the critical part here is to always overestimate how much time it's going to take, particularly on these sort of cross-functional reviews. Whenever you send it off to your teammates across different departments and you're asking for them to take the time to read these documents and provide insights, it's always going to take twice as long as you think it's going to take. So really, I think that's where the scoping comes in, having all of the pieces together early in the process, developing an outline very early on to then share with the team and make sure that everyone is on board with the overall approach and the outline and the structure. If there are missing documents, you have a plan for when and how those documents will be delivered. And that I think it requires a lot of organization and a lot of sort of working on what you can while the other pieces are in limbo and waiting to be finalized. But ultimately, you really do need to have a lot of these decisions made prior to beginning those searches. Once you get those searches set in stone and you start actually doing the systematic literature review, it's really frustrating if you have to go back in later and rescreen that. That's a really big opportunity for losing a lot of time in a timeline.
All right, we have about 15 minutes left, so if you haven't sent us your question yet, do so as soon as you can. Here's our next question. This attendee is asking, what are the key points when doing literature research?
Knowing your keywords, I think, is really critical. We have reference librarians on staff, and they are able to use very detailed search strings that allow us to capture very targeted information, and also to exclude potentially off-topic information. And that, I think, is really critical. If you're searching through just PubMed, the way that the PubMed search strings are set up, it doesn't allow you that same level of detail, really drilling down to the exact research question that you want to get at, as it would if you were to work with a qualified reference librarian and search across something like Medline or Embase. So what I found is that if you have some of the initial searches that we will receive from clients, if they use just the basic terminology, they may get 1,000 articles that are retrieved. And then these articles all have to be screened and evaluated and extracted by hand. When we can pull in a reference librarian, we can often cut that down by half or more, just by making sure that we're not screening through all of these off-target hits. And that can definitely save you a lot of time and energy and man hours when you're planning these projects. So I would say knowing your key search terms, having well-established PICO terms that everyone has agreed upon, and then knowing how to translate those PICO terms into proper mesh terminology to allow you to really get at the research question.
All right, this attendee is asking, on average, what's the timeline at Criterion Edge for performing, searching, and writing SVR and SOA reports when you have all the inputs?
So in our experience, this can be done on a condensed timeline if all of the pieces are together and we have that sort of regular interaction with the clients. If they are timely in if we ask for a particular document and we can get it right away, I would say we've done some of these SVR and SOA reports in as little as 6 to 8 weeks. It's less than ideal, but it can be done if everyone is organized. Really, it's that getting that scoping down so that we can begin the process of these literature searches is really the most critical step. Once we all agree upon the PICO terms and the list of competitors and all of that sort of basic information, and then we've worked on crafting an outline, the rest of it can go together pretty efficiently, but we have the bandwidth to be able to support a large project like this. We have a whole team that can help with data extraction. If you were the average person, you have to sort of think about, if I were to try to look for pieces of information or data in a bunch of articles, and I have a file folder sitting on my desktop with 200 articles, how long is it going to take me to scan through all of those articles and find which articles include relevant performance measures and which don't? You know, if you have a whole team where that's all their job is and they're dedicated to that, that definitely keeps the timelines much more manageable.
All right, thanks, Sarah. Moving on to our next question. What do you need to have in place before starting the clinical evaluation process?
I think step one is the IFU and your intended purpose. Having clarity on those two documents, that's going to be extremely helpful because ultimately that's going to help you pull a lot of those PICO terms together to start the initial search process. Once you get into sort of the IVDR world, the other thing that we need to have before we can really even get a sense of how difficult or challenging a particular SOA or an SVR project is going to be, that really we need to know the details of how the test is conducted. If your test is detecting one PCR product, that is much simpler than if you have a multiplex assay that can simultaneously detect 200 or 20 different analytes simultaneously, because you're expected to present the validity of each of those individual analytes one by one by one. So the technical documentation and the sort of specifics of how your device works or how your test works is also something that we really like to have very early on, because it helps give us a better sense of how complex the particular project is going to be. The more indications, the more anatomies, the more patient populations you have, the more detailed and the more subsections then you will be including within your SOA section.
All right, thanks, Sarah. Here's our next question. Can you thoroughly describe state of the art and what it really includes?
So the state of the art, we've definitely covered this in quite a few of our previous webinars, because having someone who's comfortable and confident writing these state of the art sections is really helpful. Think of it as what is currently considered best practice within the field as a whole. So within a state of the art section, you're going to present the medical condition itself and any sort of details or differences between certain patient populations. You'll present alternatives for making that same diagnosis or making that same or treating the same condition. So you'll have the medical condition, the alternatives. You'll also present information related to clinical practice guidelines. But then you're going to spend quite a bit of time discussing your closest competitors. You're not going to include any data on your device in the state of the art section. And that's often a point that a lot of clients are a little bit confused by. They want to know, where does their data go? And that will fit within the clinical literature section or within the CPR and APR if you're an IVDR person. But the state of the art is really providing that lay of the land, the landscape. And so you're going to provide information regarding who you deem to be your closest competitors based on the technical aspects of the way the device or the test performs. And then you're going to describe all and extract all of the data for those competitors, and use that to help you calculate a range of what's considered to be acceptable safety and performance based on your closest competitors. So really, the state of the art is telling you, it's giving you the background information you need to see where your particular test fits into the grander scheme of things.
Okay, great answer. Let's move on to our next question. This audience member would like to know the differences and similarities between IVDR and MDR projects. What can you say about this question, Sarah?
I think starting with the differences, the main difference I've seen so far for those of you who maybe have MDR experience and are now working on an IVDR project, the main difference is going to be that focus on the scientific validity that's often not necessarily called out in a typical CER, meaning that, if you have a particular device that's used to treat a condition, they don't ask you to provide all of the level of, they don't ask you to justify why that particular device is what it is or how it performs. That gets into a lot more of the technical documentation. You're asked to describe the performance and the safety and the benefits and risks. Yes, but in IVD, you really do need to go into detail about why that particular analyte or whatever that test is detecting, how does that correlate with a clinical condition or a physiological state? So there is that extra added step of justifying your choice of analyte and describing the limitations of the analyte itself. In terms of similarity, a lot of the sections overlap quite a bit. We are treating the scientific validity section very similar to how we would write a typical SOA section. When we're writing a CPR, it would be very analogous to the clinical literature section within a CER. And the analytical performance report is another area that's slightly different in that you typically don't have quite as much of the technical data regarding the assay itself in a typical CER project. But I think that's kind of the purpose behind in IVDR, why they're breaking it down into 3 separate reports. They want to make sure that you're addressing both the clinical sensitivity, the sensitivity and specificity in a patient, but also under sort of ideal circumstances, under the sort of inside your building and then outside of your building kind of data. So they want to see both the in-house experiments done under completely controlled settings. That's going to tell you the analytical specificity and sensitivity. But then they want to see how does it perform once it leaves the doors of your building.
Great, thanks, Sarah. Couple minutes left, so let's get to a few more questions. Here's the next question. This attendee is asking, how many writing projects go over the estimated time, and what are typically the main reasons why?
Well, for us, we are quite the taskmasters. We like to keep our projects running on time. When we are pulled into projects that are very, very late in the game, or where a client needs help completing something in a very quick turnaround, it's often that their process went astray because of changes, these late last minute changes or missing pieces. If there's any sort of delay in things as simple as like the technical documents, that can definitely affect the overall timeline and can really push things back, particularly if you are beginning your writing process based on certain assumptions, and then the tech doc is finally completed and you look at the IFU and you realize, oh, there's a different chemical composition here, or they changed the primer sets without telling me. That can require you to sort of go back to the drawing board and rethink some of your strategies in your writing. So the other thing that definitely can go over are the cross-functional reviews. The more people you pull into the review process across your organization, the longer it's going to take to get comments back. So definitely, as you're planning these projects, make it clear that you are going to need feedback in a certain amount of time, and try to make sure that you have everyone's attention and bandwidth during the time that they are going to be expected to provide that cross-functional review.
Okay, Sarah, thanks. Here's our next question. This audience member is asking, what is the difference between the terms intended use and intended purpose?
So the intended use kind of gets at the logistics of how, when, and where, and under what circumstances that test would be used. So for instance, if you have a PCR test, the PCR test would be, it's intended for laboratory use only, or it's intended for point of care assays. If it's something, or, if you have an antigen test, that can be used bedside. So the intended use, it kind of gets into who's using it, how are they using it, where are they using it? Whereas the intended purpose is more, why are they using it? What is the information and the end result? What information is going to be provided based on the results of this particular test? And how does that contribute to the overall clinical course for that patient? So yeah, the intended use is more of the sort of like when, where, and the intended purpose is more of the why.
Okay. We have time for one last question. So here it is, Sarah. How do you confirm that the CER is compliant with the relevant requirements?
I think referring to MedDev frequently and making sure that you are, as silly as it sounds, using cross-referencing within your document as you are taking each section, one section at a time. So for instance, if we are trying to make sure that we have certain information contained within our CER, we will say C section and then insert a cross-link or a cross-reference to additional sections within the CER. That definitely helps you ensure that connectivity, and also gives you a sense of, am I missing something? And is it, is there a section that is not fully supported? But yeah, so having a good solid organization in your template, making sure that you're being very transparent in how you've conducted your searches, that's going to be really critical for ensuring compliance. But really, it comes down to having somebody who has experience in regulatory writing to really help you sort of navigate this process. It can definitely be intimidating when you're thinking, I'm taking all of these documents and it's going to somehow pull together into this 300-page report, but not feel like it's so overwhelming that the average notified body can't pick it up and read through it. So that organization will help you ensure that you're being compliant, but it will also help them have an easier read.
Okay, thanks for that answer, Sarah. We are out of time. Thank you so much, Sarah, for your presentation today. For more questions on the content we discussed today, or if you would like to learn about our services, you can schedule a free appointment with one of our specialists. Our contact information is consult@criterionedge.com. Thank you, everyone, for attending today and for all your wonderful questions. We hope this presentation helps you get started on writing your CER or PER. Have a great rest of your day, and we'll see you next time.